Okay, so welcome back to sociological theory. This week, this is September, let me see, I believe this is September 20th through the 24th, if I'm not mistaken. I'll make sure I'm giving you all the right, yes. So this is September 20th through the 24th, and we are discussing Emil Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, and Jane Addams. So last week we talked about Du Bois, spent a whole week just on Du Bois, and now we're talking about some of the other theoreticians and other scholars that are looked at as being so part of the sociological foundation or the foundation of our discipline. They're also part of it, but sometimes they're not always mentioned, right? So you have, I think we talked about Marx, Weber, and Durkheim as the big three. And so Durkheim is a part of that big three, but then Du Bois is not always part of it until we get to Addams's work, which now has moved Du Bois into being one of the key influential figures to actually being part of the fathers of sociology. Now there's no way that could be argued. Also Jane Addams, who we're going to talk a little bit about in this lecture series, she too is another person who is part of that sociological foundation. Talcott Parsons is just one of those influential figures, so we'll talk a little bit about him as well. And so that's what we'll be discussing this week and talking a little bit about the ways in which they have contributed to this discipline. With that being said, we can go ahead and go to the next section. Also, I will be discussing your papers pretty soon. Probably next week is when I'll either create a separate video or it'll be a part of that video where I'll go into a little bit more detail about your essays. I just wanted to get a few theories and get through a few lectures so that you can have an idea of how it's going to be done, and then we will go into into talking a little bit more about your papers, the final sociological analysis paper. So the next slide, theoreticians. So we'll be talking about Durkheim, Parsons, and Jane Addams. And so with Durkheim again, Durkheim takes us into what is sociology. So he helps again to give us an overall idea about what sociology is and some of the concepts that we can use to then apply to the very basics of the discipline. And so when we think about sociology, we did a whole, a layout of exactly what it is in detail. We did it through a historical framework, and then we broke it down into a much more bite-sized definition. This is another bite-sized definition of sociology. Sociology is about identifying the relationship between the social conditions and people's behavior. So it's just kind of another way of how we discussed it before, where we talked about the intersection of history and biography. So we look at history, what is going on during a historical time, and how it affects people's lives and how they respond to it. So it's just another way of saying what we said earlier, just another definition. And so Durkheim talks about how social facts, right? Social facts encourages or influences sociology. And it is the social facts that kind of set us apart from psychology in a way, which I think is a real interesting way in which he kind of looks at this. And he talks about it. I believe he mentioned psychology a couple of times in this reading. And so he does a really good job of making that differentiation. So for those of you who, I think it's at least one person that introduced themselves to me. But I also think it's a couple of other people in this class who are also psychology and sociology majors. And so I think this reading with Durkheim does a really good job of showing the differentiation between psychology and sociology, but also how looking at it from both of those perspectives gives you all a much better look and a much better understanding, and maybe even a much more comprehensive understanding of the way in which people live, because you're trained both in how to look at people individually, but also how to look at people as a collection of their total parts, as part of a collective identity, right? So you'll be able to look at a person's individual life, assess it, ask them questions, but then you'll also be able to look at how them as an individual connects to them as a male, if it's a male patient or a female patient or a patient of color or a patient who is an immigrant or something like that, right? So you'll be able to do both of those. So that's why I think you all for sure will definitely be able, you benefit from studying both psychology and sociology, and Durkheim does a good job of explaining these. And so what he says and how he defines and what he contributes to the discipline is this notion of social facts, and explaining to us that social facts are the things, the institutions, the norms, and the values that we use in the external parts of our lives, in the external parts of society, that contribute to the individual. So it shows how the environment is used to sometimes constrain the individual. Michel Foucault talks a lot about that, right? How our society constrains us. And he particularly discusses it within the context of modernity. So in modernity, we think that the further we go and the more we go into the future, the more liberated and free we should be. But in actuality, it has not been that way. And he has a different way of looking at it. It's quite fascinating. And so social facts, again, talks about how the larger institutions, so when we talk about institutions, we're talking about religion, we're talking about the educational structures, we're talking about the medical industry, we're talking about housing, we're talking about the family, marriage, sex. How do all of these things play a role in the individual, and how the individual understands themselves, and how the individual's behavior responds to, reacts, or perpetuates the larger social conditions, these larger institutions. Social facts are also the norms. So what is it that society has already told us? What is it that society has said to us? What is it that society allows that says is normal? And then how does that influence our behavior? How does that play into sociology? So whatever is considered to be norm of value, right, of importance. And that's why we get the values, because you have norms, and then those norms then dictate what is of value and what is not of value. So when we talk about norms, what is a norm in society? For example, a big norm is getting married, right? That seems to be a norm. That's something that, while everybody doesn't have to get married, but if you get married, there is a value associated with that. There are tax breaks associated with that. There is a certain status that is associated with having a spouse and having children and having a traditional family. That's why it's called traditional, because it is a norm, right? So a person who does not fall into that, again, living in a free society, you have that right, but it it does not, it can sometimes be seen as less valuable, right? And so you have these institutions that create the norms that then add value to the people who subscribe to these norms, add value to the people who are seen to be at the top of these institutions, and that value then determines the individual's behavior. Some people push back against those norms, against those values, and they then that can then have certain consequences, right? And so Durkheim kind of uses this analogy of how the physical structure of a room can sometimes limit our actions, right? For example, you can go into a room, but if a room only has a door and a window, then we can only go in through the door or through the window, right? So in the same way, the social facts, which make up our social environment, the social facts, the institutions, the norms, the values, what we can do, what we can't do, that then constrains how we move about. It tells us our norms, it tells us our values, our beliefs, our ideologies. And so it limits our choices, right? What we are allowed to do. So if you live in the United States has a certain social environment, and there are certain constraints in terms of how you can move throughout society, all right? If you were to live in Japan, there's a different set of social facts there that then constrain and determine how you can move throughout society based on Japanese norms, based on the values, the beliefs, the ideas of that society. And so that is essentially what social facts does. So again, like if you were to go in a room, depending on the room, depends on what you can do, right? Depends on if you go in a room and then someone comes and attacks you, you only have certain options. You know, if you only have a door, a window, and whatever, then you have these options on how you can get out. Depending on the room, depends on the options. If you go in another room and there's a sneak door under the bed, then maybe you can go down there, right? So every room is an environment. Every room is a society. And that society has these certain social facts or these doors or windows or trap doors or whatever that allows you to make choices. And so as far as Durkheim is concerned, these rooms are really no different to the concept of human life. And that human life is greater than the sum of the individual cells which make it up, right? So essentially, if you're a psychologist, you're looking at society as these individuals, right? And every individual is significant. But Durkheim is saying that human life is greater than the sum of each individual cell. So it's not just about each individual person, it's about how do these people make up this greater collective. It causes us to think bigger than individual power or individual gain, right? That's why a lot of times sociology sometimes becomes in conflict with the American tradition. And we're going to talk about this more a little bit later. But the US tradition prides itself on individual liberties, right? You have the Bill of Rights. Every person has the right to this, and this. You have individual liberties, individual rights. That was one of the main things that the United States took away from the Age of Reason? I believe it was the Age of Reason. And we talked about it, the Age of Enlightenment, the Enlightenment period. That was one of the main things that the United States took from the Enlightenment period, from the Age of Reason, that the government should reinforce individual liberties for each person. And it sounds good within a certain type of context. It sounds good within a certain type of thought process. It sounds good within a morale society. But if that society is immoral, and if that society is built off of immoral behaviors and characters and traditions, then that can be very, very dangerous. So it really just depends. Individual liberties can be a great thing, or it can be extremely harmful. And so sociology sometimes is in conflict with that, because individual liberties can sometimes perpetuate oppression. Okay. And so Durkheim is basically saying that we have to come out and look at each other as a collective of individuals and not just a person. not just one individual. Although you are one individual, you also represent a collective, right? So for example, I'm an individual. I'm Jonathan Grant. That's who I am. But also in looking at me, there are these other parts of who I am, right? I'm a person that is a native of Jacksonville. So when I say that, there's a certain type of connection. That means if somebody meets me and I say I'm a native of Jacksonville, and then I behave in a certain way, whether good, bad, or indifferent, that's something that they're going to remember. The next time they meet a native of Jacksonville, they may make that connection. It doesn't necessarily mean they're right, but we naturally make a connection when somebody says that they represent a certain group, and you represent a certain group every time you describe yourself. Somebody were to look at me and I'm an African-American, then they say, okay, this person is an African-American. Now, how I act or how I behave or the way I think is not indicative of every single African-American, but to some degree, I do represent that when I step out. Right? So we all are a collection of, or we all represent, even as individuals, we represent a larger collective. And how the larger collective and what happens with that larger collective affects us as individuals. So if you're a woman, even though you're an individual and you're unique and you may not have gone through certain things that other women have gone through, the fact remains that if you are a woman, what affects women can ultimately affect you. And how you move through society and some of the things you do can ultimately affect the larger group in some way. Now, it doesn't mean that if you just as a woman do one thing, every single woman on the face of planet Earth is going to be affected. But if enough people think like you and do what you do, then yes, that can have a larger effect on womanhood in wherever you are. A lot of people look at the way in which, I think actually I remember somebody writing this in an assignment. I think it was this class, or it might have been another class, but somebody wrote this in one of their assignments where they talked about how particularly white women voted for Donald Trump. And I'm assuming this person did not vote for Donald Trump. And talked about how enough women had this idea of seeing Donald Trump as a person that could advance the interests that were important to them had a larger effect on the way in which people understood white American women and how white American women voted, because a large number of them did vote for Donald Trump, particularly in the first election. I don't know how much in the second election, but particularly in the first one against Hillary Clinton. And so that caused people to that caused scholars, pundits, political analysts to take a step back and say, okay, let's look at the white woman demographic and let's see what is important to white women. What's important to white middle-class women? Is it women issues? Is it family issues? Is it religious issues? Is it issues related to the body and having control over one's body? What is it? Because we don't know based on what can sometimes be said, but then how sometimes white women can vote. So what a person does individually, eventually enough of them, it had an effect on the larger narrative of politics among white women, right? That's the argument I'm making. So, so that is how we represent the larger collective. Another key idea of Durkheim, so before that, so society has a reality above that of the individuals who constitute it, right? So our reality is bigger than just ourselves. We have to think about ourselves as part of a larger collective. A key idea of Durkheim says that we should never reduce the study of society to the level of just the individual. So he's kind of coming at psychologists a little bit, not necessarily saying that they're bad, but I guess what he's saying is that we can't just study an individual. You can study an individual, but you also have to look at how does this individual relate to the larger collective, whether it's a collective they belong to or they don't belong to, right? And then we all belong to the collective of the human family, right? So we should remain at the level where we're constantly assessing social facts and we're aiming to explain social action in relation to these social facts, right? We should never just look at one thing, which I think is the reason why more, and so for those of you who are in another discipline, whether you're psychology and minoring in sociology or sociology minoring in psychology or something along those lines, what you're starting to find, particularly if you decide to go into academia, is that more and more people are starting to appreciate interdisciplinary work. More people are starting to appreciate those individuals who can bridge various ways of thinking into their classrooms, into their research. And so for me, I don't know if I talked about this, maybe I did, but I come from 3 different disciplines in terms of my academic background. I have a BA in theology, I have a master's degree in African American studies, I have a Ph.D. in sociology. So those are 3, to some degree, very, very different. African American studies is humanities, theology is, I guess that would be sciences. Well, no, it's arts. It's a BA, so it's arts. And then sociology is sciences, right? But yeah, so it's very, very, it can be very, very different. But a lot of people are starting to appreciate that, right? So if you do have a double major or a different major or minor, it definitely helps. And so Durkheim is kind of challenging this. I think during this time, again, everybody just kind of found a lane and stuck to it. But with Durkheim, he's saying, hey, let's kind of branch out and have larger discussions around not just what individuals are doing, but how it affects the larger society. And so when we look at this, what we end up seeing is that there are these very, very different ways in which we can assess even the same problem, right? So let me try this. Let me do this. I was going to do this a different way, but hopefully my computer allows me to do this. Actually, you know what? I can't do it. I need to look at my notes. Yeah, I need to look at my notes, so I won't be able to share the screen, but it's fine. So let's go to the next slide. And in looking at this next slide, I want you to answer this question for me, okay? What are some reasons why people may commit suicide, right? Durkheim, actually, well, he did a whole book, I think, on suicide and talks about why people commit suicide. So I want you to think about it. Think about why you think some people commit suicide. You can pause this. You can pause this video and think about it. Come up with maybe 5 different reasons why people may commit suicide. So you have some people, right, who say people commit suicide for various reasons, right? They could be psychologically depressed, right? They could be psychologically depressed. They could have maybe gone through a divorce, right? They gotten their heart broken. Some people may commit suicide because they're unhappy. Some people may commit suicide because they may get bullied, right? Some people may commit suicide for other reasons. They just feel like they have nothing else to live for. They feel alone. Some people feel alone. Some people feel disconnected from society. I think some people have said that I don't know if the suicide rates have gone up since COVID, but some people have talked about the disconnection that people have felt from human interaction because of COVID has definitely influenced mental health, and that more people have been needing to talk to a therapist because there is this lack of connection that we have to people because of COVID. And there's something beautiful about hugging someone, laughing with people, being close to people, and not having to worry about if you're going to live or die by being close to somebody. So yeah. And if you can think of any other ones, feel free. And so when we think about these feelings, how are these feelings alike? What do these feelings have in common? And if you think about it, the feelings that everything I just named, it may be a lot of the things that you have that you've named or thought about, is that they are overwhelmingly feelings of unhappiness. Okay. The only other example might be that if somebody commits suicide because of religious reasons, right? There are some people who believe they have to give their life for a cause. Those situations, maybe not, but most people will probably say people commit suicide because they're unhappy. Okay, they're unhappy. And so this example is just one explanation about why people may commit suicide. And it's not necessarily wrong. In fact, again, if you do a lot of psychological studies, if you do a lot of studies that look at the individual, you'll find that a lot of it is probably correct in the reasons why people commit suicide. But now let's take this to a larger conversation, okay? So now I'm gonna ask a similar question, but in a different way. Why do you think the rate of suicide is higher in California than it is in Ohio? Okay. So again, most people believe that suicide happens because people are unhappy. And this is sometimes called the unhappiness theory of suicide. People commit suicide because they are seriously or chronically or profoundly unhappy. So now asking the question in a different way, why is the suicide rate higher in California than it is in Ohio? And if I'm not mistaken, it is actually true. It is higher in California than Ohio. And I want you to think about that. You can pause the video, maybe come up with 3 or 4 reasons as to why the suicide rate is higher in California than it is in Ohio. And so, for some of you, you probably thought about it. And some of the things that may have come to mind, right? Number one, California has a faster pace of life. When you think about living in California, you think about traffic, think about housing, crowded, right? a more competitive lifestyle. If you go for a job in California, you have to compete with a lot more people because it's so crowded out there. It's not just crowded, but it's crowded with people that are very successful. And they want to live in California because of the beautiful weather and beautiful homes, and it's close to Hollywood, and there's a lot to do. Well, depending on where you live in California, you can be close to Hollywood. It's a lot to do. Lifestyle. More competitive lifestyle. Some people may say the rate of suicide is higher in California than it is in Ohio because there's a higher cost of living in California. And so there's this stress of having to make a lot of money so that you can maintain that cost of living. Gas is high, housing is high. You can't even think about getting a house without $1 million. Just a regular house, regular size house that you would get in Florida or somewhere in the South. You can't even really think about it without $1 million. Actually, I went to a friend's house in California. It was a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom. They called it a house. It was really an apartment. She paid almost $500,000 for that. I was like, what? This is crazy. Bigger cities. Some people say that in the bigger cities, there's more drug use. When you think about big cities like Chicago or LA or New York or San Francisco, say, oh, those are big cities. There's a lot of partying. There's a lot of drug usage. At least more than what you would find in maybe more rural, slower paced areas like Ohio. And so these are some of the things you may think about when you think about the suicide rate being higher in California. Now, if you think about what you said, maybe you wrote it down, maybe you just remember what you said. If you think about the answers to the questions about the suicide rate in California and Ohio, and then you go back and you think about what you, or why you said the reasons people commit suicide as a whole, what is the difference between those two sets of answers? What is the difference between those two sets? If you think about it, the questions about suicide in California and Ohio, all of those refer to factors that are external to the individual. You talked about pace of life. Well, that's not, you can't really control pace of life. That's just where you live, for the most part, right? It's just where you live. It's just naturally going to be faster paced or naturally going to be slower paced. If you live in Arkansas, it's just naturally going to be slower paced than if you live in New Jersey or Philadelphia, right? A competitive lifestyle. Can't really control that. That's just, it just depends on where you live. Cost of living, that's economics. Generally speaking, I mean, I guess a collective of individuals can control the cost of living, but the cost of living is outside of your personal individual control. You as the person do not have a significant impact on the cost of living. It has to be a lot of individuals that can have an impact on the cost of living. The size of cities, big urban networks, big urban cities. We're going to talk about that later too, but that's a social factor. Living in the metropolitan areas and what happens in big cities, that is sociological. That is what we call urban studies. Cost of living and things like that. That has to do with mobility. The rate of drug use. That doesn't have anything to do with you individually. The rate of drug use is due to how much drugs are available to people, who brings the drugs in. Are drugs, which drugs are seen as harmful and which drugs are not. All those are sociological conversations. And so when you think about it, depending on how I ask the question, it causes you to think more psychologically, the individual, unhappy, depressed, you suicidal because of all of these things related to you, Or why is the rate of suicide higher in California than in Ohio? Now you're thinking more sociological. It's the environment. And how is the environment contributing to suicide? And this is a really good example of social facts and sociological thinking, and how this notion of social facts causes us to think differently about a situation. So if we look at both sets, the previous set talks more about feelings, and those feelings we now see refer to factors such as the individuals, but then also we can look at something more sociological and also explain that sociological explanations can also impact and emphasize human behavior. These external factors can also influence individual or have individualistic explanations for why something occurs. And this is why sociology is necessary. And the second set is what Durkheim says, this is how we should be thinking according, to Durkheim. And so with that being said, I want us to think about, now we're moving more into Durkheim and actually answering some questions, because now Durkheim kind of lays it out with the social facts, and now he's going into an actual critique of capitalist society. Okay, now he's going into an actual critique. He's the one who presents this notion of division of labor. He's not as much of a capitalist. I don't know if he's as against it as Marx is. Marx is, totally anti-capitalist, but I definitely think Durkheim has an issue with capitalism for sure. And so he begins to challenge the notion of capitalism here. And so this is a question, going to that next slide where it says Durkheim. I want you to think about this. I do really want you to pause the video, and I really want you to think about this question. Can a stable relationship exist between two parties who hold different economic power and status? Okay, I want you to think about that question. Can you have a stable relationship between two people who hold different economic powers and status, and they're polarized? So a person who has a lot of power versus a person who does not have a lot of power. And can they maintain a stable relationship? And so think about it in general. And then I want you to think about, can this relationship exist in the context of a capitalist society? So think about, can it exist at all? And then the next time, and then B, I want you to think about within capitalism and what capitalism is. Can those two different powers, two different status positions, can they maintain a solid, stable relationship within a capitalistic society? So take some time, think about it, talk to a friend, talk to roommate, parents, whoever, wherever you are, and then come back and we'll discuss this some more. All right, so now, coming back, let's see. So if we look at Durkheim and how Durkheim would respond to this question, I think after reading the reading, we would see that Durkheim would say a stable equilibrium can never truly exist within an economic society as long as this division of power exists. So essentially he would say no, right? A stable relationship can exist when you have these very different economic powers and people with very different economic status, particularly within the capitalist society. Some of you may agree, some of you may disagree, but this is what Durkheim says, and this is why he believes this. So if we go to his main theory, or the main concept, which is subordination under compulsion. Subordination under compulsion. He says an unwillful subordination under compulsion is an unwillful acceptance of the current state of affairs existing within the modern division of labor, causing a dissident between those who have power and those who do not. And so essentially, a capitalist society thrives off economic relationships. A capitalist society thrives off the relationships of people who have, people who don't have not, people who have a little bit, but not as much as the haves, people who don't have a lot, but they have a little bit more than the have-nots, right? That's how a capitalist society is formed, and that's how it operates. And so economic relationships, economic status is an important part of a capitalist society. And the relationships and members of that society is important to them. Success is garnered in a capitalist society through the idea of there being subordination under compulsion, which again means that there has to be an acceptance of the status quo. There has to be an acceptance of how things are, particularly by the proletariat, particularly by the workers. And then if there is just an acceptance that this is the way things are, this is how things are going to be, then that is going to cause some dissidence between those who have power and those who don't. And so to make this more relevant, what subordination under compulsion says is that we need a society where people are going to be rich. People are going to be rich, super rich. You're going to have your Bezos. You're going to have your Bill Gates. You're going to have your, who's the other guy? The big investor. Forgot his name, but you know what I'm talking about, right? So you're going to have these people. You're going to have the very wealthy people, the millionaires, right? A few billionaires, but definitely a lot of hundred millionaires. But most of the people are going to be workers. And when the people who know that they're getting exploited, which is probably all of us, unless you're, I don't know, maybe I'm not a millionaire, right? But probably you, or maybe even your parents, or you may know somebody. If you're a worker, if you don't own a large company or you don't own your company, you're a worker and you're more than likely being exploited. More than likely, you're not getting paid what you're worth. And there has been an acceptance of that. Sometimes it's saying, well, I know I'm not getting paid what I'm worth, but I'll take it. I might be getting paid $85,000, but I know I'm worth 120. But you know what? I can live off 85. But then you realize the government is going to take a third to a half of that, and then you got to pay all your bills. So you're really living off a lot less than that. But there's a certain level of acceptance. You know what? It is what it is. So that's the subordination under compulsion. But you also have, on the other hand, there is this dissidence. There is this, but it's still not right. For so many people to be hungry, so many people to have to go through issues of, especially during COVID and health issues and all of that, and Jeff Bezos is flying to the moon. Some people don't like that. So there's this dissidence between those people in power, those people who have, and those people who don't have. Now, there are some people who say, hey, Jeff Bezos worked hard. He should be able to go to the moon if he wants. If you wanted to own Amazon, you could have owned Amazon. You should have come up with the idea. He came up with the idea. He worked hard. He sacrificed. Now he's making a gajillion dollars. He can do what he wants to do. Some people believe that. Others, his workers and Amazon is not known for being a great place to work, especially if you're like a lower level worker. So Durkheim talks about this, and Durkheim also highlights that there's a state of chaos that exists within society in which those in power gain from the expense of those who don't have power. And so when we live in that kind of society, there's going to be perpetual chaos. We're going to talk about it a little bit more later when we talk about the labor movements and Jane Addams. But essentially, the United States has had and has lived in a state of perpetual chaos ever since first became its own independent nation. There has been constantly, to some degree, some fighting between groups of people because for the balance of power, whether it be racial, whether it be class, whether it be gender, whether it be all three, or whether it be it's racial for a couple of years and racial may not be as important, and then it becomes class and that might die down. You know, there may be racial tension build up, and that may typically alongside racial tension is usually where then gender conversations come about, and then there becomes, you know, the fight for equality for women, and it's just been like that for a very long time, at least since I've you know, done U.S. history, and you can clearly just see constant tension. And Durkheim might call that chaos because there's never really a time of just everything is at peace. For the most part, everybody's happy. So Durkheim highlights that there's a state of chaos that exists within a society when the workers are forced to live under the subordination under compulsion. And he said, and a large reason why this exists is because of something that the United States builds itself on, which is individual liberties. It prides itself on offering individual liberties, but Durkheim says this actually reinforces the concept of subordination under compulsion. This actually makes it worse. This exacerbates it. This promotes it. Because he says it is a byproduct of the chaos when it's caused by this notion of subordination under compulsion, because people have this internal desire to want more. People have an internal desire to want to achieve more, especially if they see other people have it. Then they think to themselves, well, why can't I not have that? So people have this desire to want more, but having more is limited. Having more is limited by outside external powers, and that suppresses their advancement. So you have somebody who's poor, or working class, but they see people living middle class, upper middle class, they see the super wealthy, and they wonder, well, why can I not have that? And I should be able to have that. And they want it, but then guess what? There's certain powers, or what they call the powers that be, that won't allow everybody, or even most people, to have access to that. Whether it be access through education, whether it be access through resources and money, whether it be access through job opportunities, it's not as likely as people would think. And so these moral powers come in the form of economic class distinctions. And these class distinctions of a person being poor or working class or middle class or upper middle class or upper class, these things define the divisions of labor within a society. If you're working for $10 an hour, but you have this natural inclination, this natural desire to want to make 6 figures, 7 figures, 8 figures, but there's no way that you can work yourself from $10 an hour to 8 figures. You can't work yourself doing that. There has to be some kind of luck. Something happens. Somebody sponsors you. You can quit your job, put your time in doing. But to try to work and get raises to go all the way up to 6, 7, 8 figures, I don't know how likely that is. But again, you can catch a break, sure. But that's why it's called a break, because it typically is luck. It's not something that's just available to everybody who works hard. We're going to talk about that a little bit later too. But hard work does not always equal success. And wealth scholars will tell you that. People who study race and wealth will tell you, and not even race and wealth, class and wealth, will tell you that a majority of the workers in America work hard. Majority of workers have 2 jobs. Very few people work as hard as the workers. And a majority of them will stay within that class status Generally, we call that caste status, but we don't like to say that the United States is a caste system because it doesn't sound good. But if you ask Isabel Wilkerson and her, I would say this is her second New York bestseller. That's what it's all about. The United States as a caste system, right? So these moral powers come in the form of economic class distinctions, and they define the modern divisions of labor. They define who is in what class, and what class you sit in largely determines what limitations you have. And so it's under this assertion that an individual is only, and this is quite fascinating, that you are only as free as your money. You are only as free as the economic capacity will allow you to be. You are only as free, per se, as someone who has a higher economic capacity than you, or someone who has more money than you. So you can only go so far as the person who will allow you to work. If you're a worker and you ask, if you're a worker, if you're a blue collar worker and you want to make more money to buy your kids or buy your family members Christmas gifts, in order for you to do that, if you work in making paycheck to paycheck, in order for you to do that, you would have to ask for more hours. You would have to ask for overtime to somebody who has more money than you, to your boss, your supervisor, the owner. And they will have to say yes or no. So somebody who has more money than you determines how far you can go and how free you can be. And this is what Durkheim is saying: subordination under compulsion. This is the society in which we live. And this comes out of the Industrial Revolution. And so I'm asking you the question: how true is this statement? Do you think it's true? You think Durkheim is wrong? You think I'm wrong? Are you only as free as your money will allow you to be? Can you be freer than someone who can you be as free as someone who has more money than you? Again, not talking about catching a break, not talking about working a side job. I'm talking about for the masses of people. And again, and you can email me, you can come to the office hours, whatever. I've had people email me their thoughts and we have really good conversations, or inbox me or something like that. Or you can just keep it to yourself or talk to your classmates or your roommate or whoever. But something to think about, right? Are you as free as your money will allow you to be? Think about medical insurance. Medical insurance is a great example. You can only get the care that you can afford. If you can afford great healthcare, you will get great healthcare. Now, we're supposed to live in a society that grants some basic level of healthcare to everybody, but let's just be honest. If you have a great healthcare plan and you pay a lot of money per month, then when you get hurt, you have access to more things. Now, it doesn't mean that you will have access to everything. It doesn't mean that you still can't die from something. Steve Jobs is an example. Brother was crazy rich, died of pancreatic cancer. Earlier than probably he should have, because he was still rather young. So having money doesn't necessarily, we're going to look at that later, having money doesn't mean you're always going to be happy, always going to be healthy. There are things that are more important than money, but it definitely improves your quality of life. I remember one time, I tell this story sometimes to my students. I remember one time I got in an accident, and it was like a 7-car pileup. And at the time I was in grad school, I didn't have a lot of money at all. I was subleasing an apartment. I think I had a part-time job. I was in school full-time. I didn't have a lot at all. And I was with my roommate. It was a young lady, and we were driving to meet some friends. And it was raining, and all of a sudden a car came out of nowhere, bam, hit us, rammed us into the wall. Everybody going like 70, 80 miles an hour. So this was big. And we thought we were gonna die for real. And then another car hit us, boom, boom, boom. And it was like a 7, 8 car pileup. Blessed that, we survived it. Didn't have any scratches. I still got arms issues to this day from that, but like an arm issue on my left shoulder. But besides that, nothing really. I remember the ambulance came and they were like, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And we were like, "Yeah, we're fine, we're fine." They said, "Do you want to go to the hospital?" Because we were walking around and everything. And we were like, "Well, no, we good." They say it could be some internal damage that you won't know until later. You might want to go to the hospital. I said, "I don't have any insurance. I can't afford to go to the hospital. So right now, I think I'm good. I'd rather just go home." And they said, "Well, don't worry about it. The accident wasn't your fault, so you don't have to pay for it." And I said, "Oh," I was in my early 20s. I was like, "Oh, okay, I'll go then." And I went to the hospital. And I knew this was before I really started studying sociology very deeply, but I knew even then, man, I can't afford to get sick. I can't afford to have that bill. I'm not gonna be able to pay that. And I don't think I had insurance at the time. So I said, I'm not going to nobody's hospital because I can't afford it. But I shouldn't have to think that way because I didn't cause the accident. It wasn't my fault. But I knew enough to know I don't have the money to get quality health care. And we shouldn't necessarily live in a society like that, where you have to decide whether you're going to go to the hospital and get care or try to stick it out and hope that you live from some internal damage that may have happened to you. Luckily, there was none, but still. Legal assistance. Everybody knows that you get the justice that you pay for. It's not like that all the time, but most times, and we've seen it on big cases, we've seen it in big situations where if you can afford that 6-figure lawyer, it's likely you can get off, or you may not serve the time that you would have served or something. Now, again, you do have those situations where it doesn't matter how much the lawyer makes. It's only so much they can do. But in most situations, if you can afford that big time lawyer, you can get the justice you want. What is it? You get the justice that you can afford. That's why most poor people, most working class people, most people of color, African Americans who get jammed up by the police, they get what? They get public defenders who might make $50,000, $60,000 a year. They don't have time to go deep into your case. They got 15 other ones, 20 other ones. So legal assistance, you get what you pay for. You are only as free as the money, and you will never be as free as the people who are empowered that are making more money than you. Education. We all know that in some places, public schools can be trashed for a lot of students. Some places have very, very, very poor K through 12 education. But if you have the money, you can send your children, you can send your brothers and sisters, your nephews to a good school. You can send them to a school where they can get a quality education, where it's not 50 or 60 students in a class, it may be 14, 15, 20, where the teacher is making more, so the teacher will invest more, where you don't have to pay for your own pencils and paper. The teacher doesn't have to pay for pencils and paper. The teacher is less stressed. So you pay for the quality of education. Even when you think about college, you can be a great student, want to go to college, maybe not make the best grades, but you're really, really smart. You just may not be good at standardized tests. Some people have great grades, do really, really well, still can't go to college. Why? Because they can't afford it. They may get a scholarship, but the scholarships don't cover everything. And they still have to pay to live. So guess what? They may not go to college, or they may not stay in college. So again, going back to what Durkheim says, in a class society, you are only as free as your money will allow you to be. And you will never be as free as someone who has more money than you. So how does money affect our lives? How does money affect love, happiness, and freedom? I want you to check out this link. The last time I tried to do a link and share it, and then upload it to YouTube, it made me take it out. So you may have to do it. You'll have to do it yourself. So, but that was a pretty popular link, so that's why I may still do it sometimes, but I don't want to take the risk this time. So go ahead and click on that link, watch that video, and then come back and we will talk about what Durkheim says are the results of this analysis of subordination under compulsion. All right, so if we go to the next slide, we see that Durkheim talks about the results, right, of living under subordination under compulsion. And so he says, again, in a capitalist society, our desires as individuals are regulated by our economic boundaries. So you can have the desire, you can have the work ethic of Bill Gates. You can have the work ethic of, anybody who has a whole lot of money. You can have the, who's the guy who owns Tesla? Oh, I'm forgetting all these rich people's names. But yeah, you can have the work ethic of all those people, but your economic boundaries can regulate your desires. So now you have to think on this level as opposed to this level. And so human desire is subsequently suppressed by the class that we're in. So what this does is this creates more division between the haves and the have-nots. It only causes the dissonance between the groups to grow. And then that growing dissonance brings about more chaos because the status quo then becomes challenged, because at some point, people naturally are going to want to advance themselves. And so in order for them to advance themselves, they have to start thinking less about the collective and more about their self-interest. Now self-interest becomes a driving motivator. This kind of goes to what Weber was talking about when he was talking about the spirit of capitalism and the type of spirit that capitalism produces. So now you have people who are driven by their own self-interest. And so in order to move up in society, you have to focus on yourself. How does this affect me? And you have to relieve yourself of morality. And so in a capitalist society, one's success, if garnered through the subordination of another, that same subordination now has to be placed on somebody else. And now they have to suppress somebody else in the same subordination system that they were suppressed by. One of the quotes from the book says, the boundary between what is permitted and what is prohibited, what is just and what is unjust, has nothing fixed about it. It's almost like it's an all-out war. It's an all-out war for self. If I'm oppressed, but I'm looking to live like the rich people, then I got to figure out a way, figure out a system so that I can make money. But if I'm going to get to that level, somebody's going to have to be oppressed. Somebody's going to have to be down. Somebody's going to have to be exploited. It may not be slavery. It may not be as bad as sharecropping. It may not be as bad as how it's been before, but you know that you're paying that person less than what they are worth. And so the human passions stop only before a moral power they respect. And generally, most people will respect two things, and that's money or violence. And again, we're talking about systems, countries, and things like that. Real power. Real power only respects real power. But to go back a little bit. So the question I asked, can a person be a billionaire without exploiting others? Something to think about. Can you be a billionaire without exploiting others? Is there an example of a completely moral billionaire? Or do billionaires always have to cheat others, then give back to make up for the wrong they did? Jay-Z has a line, he says, I can't help the poor if I'm one of them. So I got rich and gave back. To me, that's the win-win. So he said, I'm poor, I was poor. I got rich by doing some things I probably shouldn't have done, but I did it and I have it. Now I have a lot of money to give back to those people. that I got rich off of. That's a win-win. Is it? Some people may say yeah, some people may say no. Is he alone? No. Whether you get rich off of stocks, whether you get rich off of music, business, an invention, something. Some people may argue, once you own something, now you have to have workers. And if you pay all those workers what they deserve, what they should be making and what they're worth, you probably won't become a billionaire. You become a billionaire by having workers and paying them less than what they're worth so that you can then take the profit, and then you make money off of that. That's what some people believe. But that's my question. Can you be a billionaire without exploiting people? Can you be a completely moral billionaire? Did everything right, never exploited anybody, never paid a person 1 cent less than what they were worth? And what Durkheim is saying is no. Because in order for you to do that, now you have to think about yourself. Now you have to relieve morality, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. And so this idea of subordination under compulsion, in a way, it self-regulates itself. It self-regulates. It self-regulates the chaos. And this self-regulation is necessary for individual advancement. In order for an individual to advance, they have to do this same thing, and then other people see it. And so in order for them, they realize, well, in order for me to get there, I can't think about the morality. I'm not going to resist or push back violently. I just have to be involved in the game. I have to do what everybody else is doing, and they try it. Most people fail, some people succeed, and then just keeps going, and it just self-regulates. So the question is, does this mean, however, that the desire for self-advancement is morally corrupt? We're going to talk about that in a second. So subordination under compulsion is a cycle, self-regulates because of individual achievement. There's a quote that says, I can be free only to the extent that others are forbidden to profit from their physical, economic, or other superiority to the detriment of my liberty. Meaning, I can only be free as an owner, as a capitalist, to the extent that others are forbidden to profit off of their own superiority. They can't profit to the detriment of my liberty. Jeff Bezos' workers can't profit enough to where it cuts in on Jeff Bezos' profit. And thinking like that creates the billionaires, Durkheim says. It creates the capitalists, but it's wrong. And so the question to you then is, does this mean that the desire for self-advancement is morally corrupt? Is it corrupt morally, inherently, when you seek to advance yourself? Something to think about. And so, let's see. Come on, computer. Okay, here we go. Yeah. So, discussion question. This is what I want you to do for a discussion board. You are required to engage in the discussion board post entitled Durkheim Subordination Under Compulsion. And of course, you look at your syllabus. By now, you should know what to expect, but you can look at your syllabus for instructions, and you will answer the following question. Is it morally wrong to follow one's own desire if it means that another will have to subordinate under compulsion, or be subordinate, have to be subordinate under compulsion? And so I want you to answer this question in your own words using information from the reading. So sometimes when I read some of your discussions, or sometimes when I read some of your answers, sometimes the answers are very, can sometimes be surface, and I want to see that you have an understanding of the reading. I want to see that you have an understanding of the material. I don't want you to just create or copy and paste, but I do want to see that you're using the language, that you're using the phrasing, that you have an understanding of the material. So I'm going to grade you based on how well you can answer the question and respond to someone else's comment by showing that you have a knowledge and understanding of the reading and or lecture. So if you get 100, if you get 95, if you get a 90, that means that you've convinced me that you have an understanding of the reading. By using language from the reading, using it properly, using concepts from the reading, using it properly, relating it to present day situations, showing that you know what you're talking about, showing that you can take what Durkheim is saying and answer this question using his language, using the concepts, using these ideas. And you don't have to agree, you can challenge it, but I need to see that you have a grapple and you can grapple with this material in a scholarly way. All instructions should be fulfilled before noon on September 24th, 1250. So, yeah. All right. Now we will go to the next slide. So with this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about Talcott Parsons. And Talcott Parsons, I don't know, I'm not a big Talcott Parsons fan. He was very conservative in a lot of his ideas, and his readings just aren't that interesting. But he's very good with methods, and he's very good with understanding sociology in a very kind of, he almost kind of stays in the pocket. He's a very fundamental player. I don't know if you play sports, but you have different players. You have very complex players, but then you also have fundamental players, players who have mastered the fundamentals. Talcott Parsons is like that. Not very fun to watch, not very fun. Those kind of players aren't very fun to watch on TV, but they do win championships, many of them. So, Talcott Parsons talks about this notion of the unit act. And he starts us off by teaching us how to study sociology. And what he says with this and how he breaks down the unit act is he says that the basic unit of study is this unit act. And the unit act goes like this. It involves an actor or an agent. So looking at a person who is motivated to some sort of action. Okay, an actor or an agent who's motivated to an action. And they're motivated to do something. And there is an end goal towards which that action is oriented. And then there is a means to which they want to reach this end goal. So you have a person or people who work towards an action, and that action leads them to a goal. And there's a means to getting to that goal. Then there's a situation where that action takes place, right? And then norms and values shape the choices or the means to that end. So they have what they want to do. They realize what they want to do. They realize how they want to go about it. Then they wait for the opportunity. The opportunity presents itself. And now they have norms, values, ideas, traditions that shape how they're going to take advantage of that moment and use that as a means to an end. The actions then consist of the structures and processes from which humans are motivated to perform some sort of meaningful intention. We talked a little bit about this earlier when we talked, I think it was Weber, can't remember, but we talked about the 4 different types of goals or the reasons why people do things. I can't remember now, all of them, but I know one of them was value rationale. One of them was associated with capitalism. One of them, then it was like 2 more. Traditional, I think was one, and there was another. And so it's through these goal attaining methods that are put into practice within the systems, within the social systems. And these things then affect our perspectives, our cultures, our values, our norms, our personality. And so I think a good example of this, because we can lay it all out, but it's good to look at it as an example. Let's take Martin Luther King Jr., for example. I think this is a really good one. You have a unit act. And so Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. You have an actor, Dr. King, and it wasn't just him, obviously, it was a lot of people, right? But Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement, he was kind of the face of it, who worked towards an action. So what happened? There was a basic unit study, which involves an actor or an agent. He's motivated to action. So if you know anything about Dr. King, he was born and raised in Atlanta. To some degree, until he was about 6 years old, he had a very peaceful childhood. He never really dealt with racism or anything like that. He interacted with, he had some white friends. But I think when he was around 6 was when he first, I think his friend, his white friend that he used to play with outside, mother or father said that they couldn't play together anymore because he was an N-word, right? And he cried and he ran to his father and he was like, why can't I play with my friend anymore? And said what the person called him. And his father sat him down and had to explain to him, this is the world that we live in. This is what happens. This is how people are going to see you. And then begin to teach him to not let the way other people treat you dictate how you see yourself. You see yourself as a person of self-respect, a person of dignity. You are not what they say you are. So then that sparked something in Dr. King as he got older and he went through school and he had other experiences. And then eventually when he graduated high school, went to college, I think at 15 or 16 years old, he realized that he wanted to dedicate his life to social justice. So he studied sociology. He got his bachelor's degree in sociology. And that was a goal that he had. And so he took actions towards that oriented goal. He went to school to learn. He saw his father who was involved in social justice. His grandfather was involved. His grandfather founded the NAACP in the city. He saw how people in his community were involved in fighting for equality. So he got involved and he was action oriented. And then he thought about a means to reach that goal. At one point, he realized in order for us to get to this goal of equality and living in a real peaceful democratic society, we need to reach this goal through nonviolence. So that was his means. And he believed in that. He believed in that during college. He believed in that when he got his first job at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And then a situation occurred. And they actually planned this situation. It wasn't haphazard. Rosa Parks, a woman, well-respected woman in the community, got arrested because she wouldn't give up her seat on the bus. Dr. King and his crew said, this is the perfect time. A situation occurred, and guess what? An action took place. They boycotted the buses. But their norms, their values, their traditions, it shaped the means. What was the means? Nonviolence, which means we have these certain norms. We're going to march. We're going to pray. We're going to be peaceful. We're going to show that we don't have to resort to violence in order to get these things accomplished. These ideas shape the means to an end. And then the actions consist of the structures and processes from which the humans are motivated. So the culture of the time, the values that were important to them, the norms, the motivation, very much a Christian, religious, church motivation for these things, all dictated how they were going to reach the end, how they were going to reach their goal. And eventually, to some degree, they did. Okay, so that is what we mean when we talk about this unit act. And so I think Talcott Parsons does, again, a good job of kind of breaking down in a different way this sociology, almost like a scientific method a little bit. Scientific method of sociology, and kind of in a way. Now we will move on to our last slide, which is where we talk about the labor movement. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, and we're going to talk about this and then go into, then you're going to do an online assignment on Jane Addams. So When you hear about Labor Day, what comes to your mind? Do you even know why we celebrate Labor Day? We just celebrated it not too long ago. What comes to your mind? Some people may know, some people may not. But the reason why we celebrate Labor Day is because of the labor movement in America. The labor movement in America started around the time of the Industrial Revolution, right? Because this is when labor became a big deal. Before that, again, everything was agrarian. You lived on your land, you worked your land. It wasn't, kids didn't work. You made however much you planted. You made however much you worked. That was it. Nothing more. But with the Industrial Revolution, now more people are working in factories. Now more people are working in manufacturing. And so because of that, now we have to have more regulations around labor. Initially, there were no regulations. You came in, you worked all day, all night, whatever needed to be done to get the work accomplished. But with the capitalist mindset of more, this is what Durkheim is saying, there's no limit, more. If I'm a capitalist in 1850, I want as many workers as I can to make as much of the product as I can, to move as much of the product as I can, so that I can make as much money as I can. And if I have no concept of human reality and human behavior and humanity in general, I don't care. So guess what? Early on in the Industrial Revolution, there was no limits. There were no regulations. This was the late 19th century, 1850s, 60s, 70s. And the United States exploded. And when I say exploded, I just mean it was a boom in terms of industry. Society became mechanized. There were factories everywhere. You still can see the residuals of it today, of factories, right? Big, huge buildings that are now dilapidated, right? Spurred from this and that. Even if you ride around Jacksonville, right? So America exploded. Even more, the big cities exploded. This is where you get even bigger cities like your Philadelphia's, your Chicago's, Cincinnati's, Pittsburgh, big cities with big factories. And technology created these cities and created these manufacturing jobs. The more technology happened in our society, the more it expanded. Creation of the telephone, creation of the light bulb, creation of the cars and all this. Now, things are getting bigger. Bosses are getting rich, and they're getting rich off of these low wages because these people are coming from being farmers. So I can pay them a little bit more than what I would have, a sharecropper. And the bosses are getting paid huge amounts. This is why early people like Rockefeller, Carnegie made so much money. They came in at just the right time. And they made so much money because they were able to work people in unregulated labor, in an unregulated labor market. So these huge capitalist bosses got rich off of very low wages from the proletariat. So soon after people started realizing this, they're saying, wait a minute, no, this isn't right. And so this is where you start to have a labor movement. People started realizing the economic inequality, that they're getting paid this little amount. And next thing they know, they read the newspaper and the person who owns the plant, the person who owns all the steel, the person who owns all the oil, they're taking trips all over the world and have more money than a majority of the people in the United States combined. So the workers say, no, this isn't right. And so they start to create unions. They start to protest. Sometimes they may even riot. If you look at the Haymarket riots in Chicago, they call them riots, but it was really a protest. A bunch of people in Chicago. It started out as a peaceful protest. Started out as a peaceful protest, peaceful labor protest for 8-hour work days. That's all they wanted. They just wanted 8-hour work days. But then later, the police killed and injured some workers the next day. Now the protest turns angry. Now the people turn violent. And somebody throws a bomb to the police, killing a few police officers. Then some people, not as many as the police, but some people on the other side got hurt. And this caused the government to say, okay, we might need to take a look at their demands. And it was because of the labor movement from the latter part of the 19th century all the way up to the 1930s. It was because of this labor movement that now we have a work week. Now people work Monday through Friday and you're off on the weekends. It's because of the labor movement that we now have 8-hour work days. Now that we have shorter work weeks. The labor movement also protested child labor. Before, kids, 7, 8, 9, 10, were working 15, 16 hours in the factories, dying from poison, getting their arms chopped off, fingers chopped off. Jane Addams was, I believe, actually a part of that as well, protesting the child labor. Now we have child labor laws. 1881, businesses stopped hiring kids under 14. That caught on all around the country. By the time we got to 1938, the Fair Labor Standard Act was passed. Now you have unions, now you have workers who can negotiate health benefits. They can negotiate raises. Now you can do that now. Well, actually, it's changed a little bit now. But for a long time, now a lot of the jobs that your parents had or your grandparents had, they were more than likely, especially if they were blue collar workers, a part of unions that could advocate for the workers and negotiate and say, hey, our workers need to be off or this, or they need to get raises after this amount of time working and blah, blah, blah. And this happened because of the labor market or of the labor movement. Okay. And so Jane Addams is one who, and I talked about the health benefits plan too. So now we have jobs where there's some jobs where you now have a health benefits package. This was also negotiated. That didn't exist at first, but union workers said, hey, if you're gonna have all these laborers working for you, you need to pay for if they have to go to the hospital because they're working. And the more they work, that has an effect on their body. So you need to be able to contribute to if they need to go to the hospital. So these things that you have access to, it's because of this labor movement. So Jane Addams talks about this. Jane Addams was a scholar. Some people called her a social worker, and we talked about Jane Addams a little bit earlier as well, a couple of weeks ago. But she was a social worker. She went to London, and she saw this thing. She later called it settlement houses, but she saw these houses that were created and were used to help the poor and the disenfranchised in London. And she said, we need that in the United States. She lived in Chicago, so she went back to Chicago and opened Hull House. And Hull House was used as a place, as a settlement house, to help the poor and the disenfranchised, to help prostitutes, to help children, to help people that were struggling and that were in poverty during this industrial revolution, during these times. And so what I would like for you to do is I would like for you to use the reading and what we know about Jane Addams, what I just said and what we said a couple weeks ago, and explain how her settlement houses, such as the Hull House, contributed to the labor movement. Read her reading again, go back and read it, and talk about it. How did her settlement houses, how did her movement, how did her goals, how did the things that she accomplished in the reading that you were supposed to read for her in your textbook, how did that contribute to the labor movement? And I want you to use information and concepts from the reading to support your position. And again, I want you to show that you have a knowledge of the material, a knowledge of the reading. That's how I'm going to grade you. Based on you showing that you have a knowledge of what she said, you can use quotes, maybe one or two. I don't want you to use a lot of them, maybe one or two. I also want you to follow the directions. If I say I wanted 2 to 3 page, Times New Roman 12 font, all of that, I want you to follow those directions. If you don't follow those directions, you get points off. So this is a 2 to 3 page paper, double space, Times New Roman, 12 font. Only information at the top of the page, the whole thing. And your deadline for submitting this is September 27th at 12:50 p.m. And you're going to submit under online assignments. So again, answer that question, talk about, based on the reading, how Jane Addams, through her movement, through her opening of the Hull House, through her settlement houses, how does this relate to the labor movement? And I want to see that you have an understanding of the reading and of what we were just talking about with the labor movement, and how can you make that connection. You do that successfully, you get the grade you're looking for. If I feel like seems like you know a little something, not much, you'll get an average grade. It seems like it's just not working. And I can't really tell that you have a good understanding of the material, and you have a good understanding of what we were just talking about with the labor movement, and you might not get the grade you're looking for. All right, hope all is well. Have a great week. If you have any questions, email me, inbox me, come to my office hours. We'll be talking about your paper really soon. Also, I believe you have a midterm in this class. If you do, then that'll be coming up real soon. We'll talk a little bit about that. Yeah, and with that being said, again, if you have any questions, reach out to me. And as always, feel free to come to my office hours. Have a great week and a great weekend.